Assalamu alaikum friends. All praises is to Allah who created the heaven and the hell and make the darkness and the light. Before starting the lecture, I pray that you live a happy, healthy and prosperous life. My name is Saida Umama Shah and today we are going to discuss the last of the cranial fossa, the posterior cranial fossa. So let's start. Friends, as you can see highlighted in green is the posterior cranial fossa. The major thing about posterior cranial fossa is that this cranial fossa is the deepest and the largest of all cranial fossa that we studied in the previous lectures. Right? Now we are going to discuss this posterior cranial fossa in detail. So here you can see the posterior cranial fossa. We are going to discuss its features and borders, right? First, now anteriorly you can see is the superior border of the petrous part of temporal bone, while posteriorly is the inner surface of the squamous part of occipital bone. Here you can see laterally is the mastoid bone of the mastoid part of the temporal bone. Centrally placed is the foramen magnum. The foramen magnum, hypoglossal canal, jugular foramen, internal acoustic meatus. These are the openings in the posterior cranial fossa. We will discuss this in the next slides in detail. This is the clevus, and this clevus is a depression, and this clevus is formed by the basilar part of the occipital bone. I will also show you this in the next slide. Here you can see groove for inferior petrosal sinus. This is a groove for inferior petrosal sinus. This is groove for sigmoid sinus, and here is the internal occipital crest. As you can see, the internal occipital crest runs backward from foramen magnum anteriorly to posteriorly towards the internal occipital protuberance, right? Here, this is the internal occipital protuberance. Now, at each side of this internal occipital protuberance are the grooves. Here you can see these are the grooves, and this groove is for transverse sinus. Now, one more thing that you have to remember, that transverse sinus join to form sigmoid sinus, right? Transverse sinus, the right and left transverse sinus, they join to form the sigmoid sinus, and then this sigmoid sinus run through this foramen magnum and form the internal jugular vein, right? Now coming to the next slide, here you can see jugular tubercle, internal occipital protuberance, internal crest. Okay, one more thing about internal crest is that the falx cerebelli attached to this internal occipital crest, right? And I'm going to show you in the next slide. And all I think we studied this in the previous slide. Okay, now coming to the next slide. Here you can see this is the falx cerebelli, and this falx cerebelli is attached to the internal occipital crest, right? And that I told you that internal occipital crest went backward from anterior to posterior, from the posterior side of the foramen magnum to the anterior side of the occipital protuberance of the occipital bone, right? Okay, now here you can see is the tentorium cerebri. This tentorium cerebri forms the roof of the posterior cranial fossa, and this tentorium, the most important thing, most important thing about tentorium cerebri is that it intervenes between the posterior cranial between the cerebellum that lies below it, and above it is the occipital lobes, right? So it intervenes between the occipital lobes and the cerebellum. The occipital lobe is above this tentorium cerebri, while the cerebellum is below this tentorium cerebri. And one more thing about cerebellum is that it is called as the little brain of the little brain, right? This cerebellum is called the little brain. Okay, so this was about Tentorium cerebri, as it forms the roof of the posterior cranial fossa. Now going towards the next slide. Here you can see the temporal bone. Here is the side of the temporal bone. This is the superior border, anterior border, posterior border, and inferior border. This is the mastoid portion of the temporal bone, the tympanic segment. This is the squamous part. As squamous means flat bone, right? So this is somewhat flat, so therefore it's called the squamous part of temporal, and as this is temporal, so squamous part of temporal bone. Okay, now moving towards the next slide. Okay, as you can see over here is the basilar portion, and this is of this basilar bone is of occipital bone. Now one, you have to listen it carefully. The basilar part here highlighted in pink, here will be the condylar part of occipital bone, and there will be squamous part of occipital bone. These three parts of occipital bone and the mastoid portion of temporal bone forms the floor of the posterior cranial fossa. Once again I will repeat, the floor of the posterior cranial fossa is formed by basilar portion, condylar portion, and squamous portion of occipital bone, and the mastoid portion of the temporal bone, while the roof is formed by the Tentorium Cerebri, as I discussed you in the previous slide. Okay, now here you can see this is the condylar, occipital condylar, right? This is the jugular notch, condylar canal. This is called the condylar canal. This is the condylar fossa. So this all is the condylar portion of the occipital bone, right? This is the external occipital crest. One was the internal occipital crest, and with that internal occipital crest, falx cerebelli was attached, right? And this is the external occipital protuberance, and one was the internal occipital protuberance. And at each side of the internal occipital protuberance, we discussed that there were groove for the transverse sulcus, and we also discussed that the transverse sinus, groove for the transverse sinus, and the transverse sinus join to form the sigmoid sinus, and then the sigmoid transmit to the foramen magnum. Okay, now moving towards the next slide. Now friends, coming towards the openings in the posterior cranial fossa. As you can see, in center is the foramen magnum. So the foramen magnum occupies the central position in the posterior cranial fossa. Now, one most important thing, it transmits the medulla oblongata and its surrounding meninges. It is important. Medulla oblongata and its surrounding meninges is transmitted through foramen magnum. Okay. Further, it transmits the ascending spinal parts of the accessory nerve, and the two vertebral arteries, right? The two vertebral arteries, the ascending spinal parts of the accessory nerve, and the medulla oblongata and its surrounding meninges. So this was all about foramen magnum. Okay, now moving towards our next opening. Here you can see is the hypoglossal canal. As you know, hypoglossal nerve is the 12th cranial nerve, right? So the name is similar. Hypoglossal canal will transmit the hypoglossal nerve, which is the 12th cranial nerve. Now, if coming towards its position, so it is above the anterior lateral boundary of the foramen magnum. Look, above anterior lateral boundary of the foramen magnum, right? Okay. Now we will discuss the internal acoustic meatus, then we will come to the jugular foramen. Okay, here internal acoustic meatus. The internal acoustic meatus pierces the posterior surface. As you can see, this is the posterior surface of the petrous part of temporal bone, and what it transmits, the It transmits the vestibulocochlear nerve and motor and sensory roots of the facial nerve, right? This is means the things, the vessels that the openings or foramina transmit. This is means important to remember, right? The vestibulocochlear is transmitted through internal acoustic meters and the motor and sensory roots of the facial nerve, right? Once again I will repeat, the internal acoustic meters will transmit what? The vestibulocochlear, right? Vestibulocochlear is the 8th cranial nerve, right? And the motor and sensory roots of the facial nerve. Now this hypoglossal canal will transmit what? The hypoglossal nerve, which is 12th cranial nerve, and the foramen magnum will transmit the foramen magnum will transmit the medulla oblongata, right? Medulla oblongata and its meninges to vertebral arteries and the ascending part of the accessory nerves. I think you remembered what I said. Okay, now coming towards the jugular foramen. This jugular foramen lies between the lower border of the petrous part of temporal bone, right? This is the lower border of the petrous part of temporal bone and the condylar part of occipital bone. This is the condylar bone. So the jugular foramen lies between the what? Between the lower border of the petrous part of temporal bone and the condylar part of the occipital bone. Now what it transmits we are going to discuss in the next slide. Here you can see anterior posteriorly. Here it transmits inferior petrosal sinus. This is jugular foramen, right? First anteriorly it transmits the inferior petrosal sinus. Now the very important thing, look here, this is the only foramen which transmit 3 nerves. Means the more nerves are transmitted through this foramina. Which foramina? Jugular foramina, where it lies between the condylar part of occipital bone and the lower border of the petrous part of temporal bone, right? Okay, which nerve it transmits? The glossopharyngeal, which is 9th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve, which is 10th cranial nerve, and the accessory nerve, which is the 11th cranial nerve, right? And one more thing, it also transmits the sigmoid sinus. So the sigmoid sinus is transmitted through jugular foramen, right? So Allah Hafiz for now. If you like my video, so subscribe to my channel. Thanks for now.